For 5 years, Jacob Stone's only company had been the ceaseless prairie wind and the ghosts it carried. He was a man whittled down to bourbon, coffee, and regret, a fortress of solitude with a bolted door and a buried past. He thought he had paid every debt he owed to this hard, unforgiving land, but on a night when the wind had teeth, a knock came that was too soft for the storm, yet loud enough to wake the dead. It was a woman with desperation in her eyes, 2 children, and a debt he never knew he'd signed for. The wind was a sermon only the prairie understood, and tonight, its voice was raw. It clawed at the sod house, testing the seams of the glass panes he'd hauled 100 miles to put in place. Inside, the world had shrunk to the unsteady circle of a lantern's glow. The hearth had given up, its embers pulsing like a fading heartbeat, offering no fight against the cold seeping through the floorboards. He sat alone at the rough-hewn table, a silhouette carved from patience and regret. The coffee in his tin cup had long gone bitter, a taste he was well acquainted with. Out here, silence was a currency, and he had hoarded it for 5 years. The only sounds were the groan of the house settling and the relentless howl of the wind, a lonesome lullaby for a lonesome man, then a sound that didn't belong. A sound too small and deliberate for the storm, a rap on the door. Not the heavy fist of a lost rider, nor the urgent knock of trouble. This was something else, soft, almost hesitant. He didn't move. He sat motionless, his head cocked, listening past the wind. Another man might have reached for the Winchester leaning by the fireplace. He just waited. The sound came again, a little stronger this time, a plea against the vast, uncaring dark. He rose slowly, unfolding from the chair, not with the stiffness of age, but with the coiled economy of a man who'd learned that sudden movements cost you. The floorboards complained under his weight as he crossed the room. He slid the iron bolt, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet, and pulled the door inward just enough. The lantern light spilled out onto the porch, catching a scene etched from desperation. A woman stood there, framed by the swirling dust and the dying light. She was worn thin by the trail, her dress little more than rags, but her eyes held a fire that the wind hadn't extinguished. Tucked into the folds of her skirt were 2 small figures, one a boy trying to stand tall against the cold, the other a girl so small she seemed more ghost than child. His face was a mask of hard country, unreadable. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You're a long way from anywhere." The woman didn't flinch from his gaze. She pulled her children closer, a lioness with nothing left but her cubs. She looked past his hardened exterior, as if searching for something buried long ago. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But you're the one we came for." She took a breath, and her next words landed with the weight of a stone. "I'm here to call in a marker, mister. Not for me. For them." His first instinct was to close the door, to let the wind have them. The world had enough ghosts without inviting more onto his land. He looked from the woman's unyielding eyes to the boy's defiant chin, then to the girl whose small face was buried in her mother's dress. He saw a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a dull ache in a place he thought had long turned to stone. He let out a breath that turned to smoke in the cold. "The barn," he grunted, jerking his head toward the dark structure. "There's hay. It's dry." He didn't wait for a reply. He shut the door, the latch falling into place with a heavy thud. For a long moment, he stood with his back to the wood, listening. He heard the shuffle of weary feet on the porch boards, then nothing but the wind again. He didn't offer food, not yet. An animal brought to shelter must first learn the measure of its cage. Later, under the cold gaze of the moon, he crossed the yard. He carried no lantern. The path from his door to the barn was burned into his memory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and animals. In the faint light from a grimy window, He saw them huddled in a far stall, the children wrapped in the woman's thin shawl. He set down his offering without a word, a slab of salt pork, half a loaf of yesterday's bread, and a dented tin of water. The woman watched him, her eyes dark pools in the shadows. She offered no thanks, and he was glad for it. Gratitude was a currency that bought obligation, and he wasn't selling that as he turned to leave. Her voice, quiet but clear, cut through the gloom. He said your name was the only one that meant something in a storm. He stopped in the doorway, his back still to her. Who did? A pause stretched, filled only by the rustle of hay. A man who knew what it was to owe a debt. He left her with that, the words hanging in the cold air behind him. The next day broke gray and grudging. He found the boy trailing him like a shadow as he went to mend a down section of fence line. The kid didn't speak, just watched with wide, serious eyes, his worn-out boots making sucking sounds in the thaw's muddy grip. The man worked in silence for an hour, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only conversation between them. Finally, he stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. He looked down at the boy. You plan on standing there all day? He rasped. The boy shook his head. The man picked up a heavy canvas bucket of nails and thrust it at him. Make yourself useful then. The boy's face lit up as he took the bucket, his small hands struggling with the weight. He stumbled once, spilling a handful of nails into the mud. A flash of shame crossed his face, and he froze, expecting a hard word. The man just let out a low grunt, bent down, and plucked the nails from the muck before driving the next post. When the work was done, the man pulled a knife from his belt and sliced a strip of jerky from a piece in his pocket. He handed it to the boy. It wasn't a gift, it was payment. For a job done, the boy took it, his eyes shining. He ran back toward the barn, turning halfway to raise a hand in a hesitant wave. The man didn't wave back, but he stood there, leaning on his hammer, and watched until the boy was just a shape swallowed by the barn's shadow. That evening, pinned to the great barn door by a splinter of wood, he found it. A child's scrawl, done in charcoal on a piece of discarded shingle. It was 3 figures, 2 small ones, and one standing tall beside them, all of them holding hands. He stared at it for a long time as the twilight bled from the sky, a strange pressure building behind his ribs. He ran a calloused finger over the rough drawing before turning and walking back to the solitude of his house. The silence that greeted him felt different now. It was heavier, less empty. 3 days passed in a quiet that felt borrowed. The man worked his land, the boy a constant, silent apprentice at his heels. The woman moved through the chores of the house and barn with a grim efficiency, her hands never idle. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and watchful glances began to form between them. He found himself listening for the sound of the children's laughter, a sound as foreign in that place as birdsong in winter. He was beginning to forget the silence he had once cultivated so carefully. That forgetting ended on the 4th afternoon. He was splitting logs, the rhythmic crack of the axe the only sound under the vast, empty sky, when his head snapped up. His eyes, trained by years of watching the horizon, had caught it, a smudge of brown against the distant blue of the hills. It wasn't a dust devil, and it wasn't wandering cattle. It was deliberate. It was coming. He didn't shout. He let the axe fall and gave a low, sharp whistle that cut through the air. From the house, the woman appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in her hand. She saw his gaze fixed on the ridge, and her face went still, all the warmth draining from it. He made a single sharp gesture toward the barn. She didn't question it. She simply disappeared inside, re-emerging a moment later with the children, herding them like a hen moving her chicks to safety. They vanished into the barn's dark mouth. He walked calmly to the porch and lifted the heavy Winchester from its pegs. The metal was cool and familiar in his hands. He didn't take cover. He stood by a porch post, waiting, a solitary figure against The backdrop of his lonely claim, the rider drew closer, eventually slowing his sweat-streaked bay to a walk at the fence line. He was a lean man who sat in the saddle with a kind of lazy arrogance, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. His eyes, when he finally raised them, were little more than chips of flint. "I'm looking for property that wandered off," the rider called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "A woman, and 2 pups she took with her." The rancher's grip tightened on the rifle stock. "Nothing here but what's mine." The words were flat. A stone wall. A slow, humorless smile touched the rider's lips. He looked the rancher up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the stubborn set of his jaw, the rifle held at a casual but ready angle. "Friend," the rider said, ignoring the claim, "you're just a fence post standing in the path of a storm. And that storm is coming right through this valley. Best to let it pass." The rancher didn't move a muscle. "This fence post holds." The rider stared for another long second, his flinty eyes making a silent calculation. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that was not an agreement, but a promise. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, not with the speed of a man in retreat, but with the unhurried pace of someone who was merely measuring a distance. The man stood on the porch until the rider was once again just a speck of dust on the horizon. He walked back inside, the slam of the door echoing the heavy beat of his own heart. The air in the small house was thick with unspoken questions. That night, he walked to the barn. The woman stood near the entrance, a silhouette against the moonlight. He said nothing, simply pushed an old, heavy sheepskin coat into her hands, a coat that had seen him through a dozen winters. She looked from the coat to his face, her expression unreadable in the dark. "So," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you see it now." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with the weight of his protection in her arms. The debt was no longer just hers to carry. It was his now, too. The sheepskin coat was a silent treaty. The next morning, he found the woman by the creek, scrubbing their meager clothes against a flat stone, her hands red from the icy water. He said nothing, just left a bar of lye soap on a rock nearby. When he returned to the house at noon, the chill was gone from the main room. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air smelled of beans and wood smoke. The floor had been swept clean of the week's dust. He stood in the doorway, a stranger in his own home. "Nobody asked you to," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned from the fire, her face smudged with ash, but her eyes were clear. "Nobody has to ask me to pull my own weight." He didn't have an answer for that evening. The girl approached him on the porch. She held out her small, clenched fist and opened it, revealing a smooth, gray river stone. "It's for luck," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Mama says we're gonna need it." He took the stone, its coolness a surprise in his calloused palm. He closed his own fist around it and nodded. It was the first gift he'd accepted in 5 years. The piece, however thin, was shattered the next day. While checking the perimeter of the smokehouse, he saw it half hidden in the dirt, the stub of a cigar, its end chewed flat. It wasn't his. No one had been on this property but him for years. Someone had been close enough to watch, to wait. He walked back to the house, the cigar stub cold in his pocket. He placed it on the table in front of the woman. Her eyes widened, and a fear deeper than any he'd seen before settled on her face. "He was here," the man stated. "It wasn't a question. You've been telling me a piece of the truth, but not all of it. The time for holding back is over." She sank into a chair, her shoulders finally slumping under a weight she could no longer carry. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, thin and brittle. "My husband ... the children's father. He wasn't just a gambler. He ran with a gang that stole land deeds from settlers. But he was playing a double game. He was an informant for the Pinkertons. The man stood rigid, listening. He kept a ledger, she continued. Names, dates, transactions, everything. The gang found out. They killed him. But they never found his ledger. They think he told the boy where it was hidden. Does he know? The man asked, his voice low. She shook her head, tears finally tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. No, he was just a child, but they don't believe that. They'll never stop looking for him, for what they think he knows. He stared at the cigar stub on the table. A final piece of the puzzle slid into his mind, cold and sharp. The man who rode. Here, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The one who smokes these. What's his name? She hesitated, then spoke the name, and the air went out of the room. It was a name he had whispered to himself in the dark for half a decade. A name he'd etched into the wall of his memory with the acid of hatred. The name of the man who had left his brother to die in the dirt of Bitter Creek. The boy who had been listening from the corner stepped forward. Are we in trouble? He asked, his small voice trembling. The man turned, and for the first time, looked at the boy not as a stray, but as something else entirely. He crouched down, bringing his hard-bitten face level with the child's. His voice was quiet, but it held the unbending strength of iron. Son, he said. Trouble found us. We're about to show at the door. As if summoned by his words, a sound cut through the settling dusk outside. A whistle. 3 sharp rising notes. A signal, then silence. The waiting was over. The whistle hung in the air, sharp as a razor's edge, before being swallowed by the night. The man didn't flinch. He moved without thought, a man becoming a tool for a single purpose. He looked at the woman, his eyes hard as flint in the lantern. Light, and gave a single sharp command. Cellar. She didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed the children, herding them toward the trapdoor in the floorboards as he moved to the front door, rifle in hand. He slid the bolt, stepped into the darkness of the porch, and melted into the shadows near the wall. He was no longer a rancher. He was a hunter on his own land. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the barn, moving low and fast toward the house. It was the scout, coming to finish the job. The man let him get close enough to smell the stale whiskey on his breath. There was a short, brutal dance in the dark, a flash of a knife met by the solid crack of a rifle butt against a jaw. The shadow crumpled without a sound. One down. He spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in a darkened corner of the room, the Winchester across his lap. The woman sat on the cellar steps, a shotgun resting near her hand. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They were 2 sentinels guarding the small flame of a family they hadn't known they were building, waiting for the wolves to come. Dawn arrived not as a promise, but as a threat, a bruised purple line on the eastern horizon. And with it, they came. Didn't ride fast. They came at a walk, 3 riders emerging from the morning mist, confident as men who owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. The man in the lead was Kane. Even at a distance, the rancher recognized the arrogant slump of his shoulders. Rancher stepped out onto the porch, a solitary figure of defiance. The woman was a darker shadow in the window behind him. Kane reined in his horse 20 yards from the house. I'll say this once, he called out, his voice grating. Send out the boy. I'll let you and the woman live. The rancher's voice was unnervingly calm when he replied, the words carrying across the yard like chips of ice. I've been waiting for you, Kane. Kane's head tilted. A flicker of recognition, followed by a low, ugly laugh. Bitter Creek? That was business. This is too. Don't die for a piece of business that ain't yours. I'm making it mine. The rancher said dot, and the world exploded in gunpowder and splinters. He fired first, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. One of the riders beside Kane was thrown from his saddle before he could even raise his own rifle. Kane dove from his horse, rolling behind the water trough for cover. The third rider spurred his horse wide, trying to flank the house. A hot poker seared across the rancher's ribs as a bullet glanced off the porch post beside him. He ignored the pain, firing again, keeping Kane pinned down. He heard the flanking rider's horse screaming as it circled toward the side of the house. He knew he couldn't cover both angles. Then, from a side window of the house, the deep roar of a shotgun echoed across the yard. The flanking rider cried out, his body lurching as he was blasted from the saddle. Kane rose from behind the trough, his face a mask of fury, firing wild. The rancher stepped clear of the porch post, the world narrowing to the man who had haunted his nights. He raised the Winchester. Time slowed. The front sight settled on the center of Kane's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was an unremarkable crack in the sudden silence. Kane stumbled backward, a look of surprise on his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood came out. He fell face down in the dirt he'd tried to claim. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the new holes in the walls of his house. He stood there, leaning on his rifle, the warm slick of blood spreading across his side. The front door creaked open. The woman emerged, the shotgun still smoking in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. Behind her, in the doorway, the two children peered out into the morning light, at the terrible cost of their safety. The marker had been paid in full. There were graves to be dug at the far edge of the property, where the wild grass grew tall. They worked together under the afternoon sun, the man and the woman, moving with the shared, wordless rhythm of a task that needed doing. He dealt with the scout from the night before, the one left breathing in the smokehouse. He gave the man a canteen of water and pointed him east. "Walk," he said, his voice flat and final. "And don't look back." The man scrambled away, a ghost disappearing back into the harsh land that had made him. Later, back in the dim light of the kitchen, she tended to his wound. He sat shirtless in a chair, the firelight playing over the hard lines of his body, while she cleaned the gash on his ribs with a cloth dipped in boiled water. Her hands, which had held a shotgun steady hours before, were now gentle, her touch sure and careful. "Should have been faster," he grunted, his jaw tight against the sting of the whiskey she used to clean the wound. "You were fast enough," she said quietly, her eyes focused on her work. She wrapped his ribs with clean strips of linen torn from a sheet. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the low crackle of the fire and the soft sound of her breath. It was the silence of after. When she was finished, she looked at him, her gaze direct. "He would have been proud," she said. He knew she meant his brother. He gave a slow, tired nod, the muscles in his jaw working. The ghost of Bitter Creek was still there, but its voice was fainter now, its hateful whisper finally drowned out by the events of the day. Vengeance was a cold meal. He had found something warmer. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sky bleed from orange to deep indigo. The two children, their faces scrubbed clean, played quietly in the dirt nearby with the Lucky River. Stone and the man's old dog, who now sported a slight limp. The land was quiet again, the violence washed away, leaving only the deep, enduring peace of the prairie. "You're free to go now," he said, his voice low as he stared out at the horizon. "The trail is clear. No one will follow you." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the children. "I think," she said finally, her voice soft but sure, "we're already home." He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and saw not the desperate woman who had arrived in a storm, but a survivor, strong as the prairie grass, her roots already taking hold in the hard soil of his land. Later, when the moon was high and the children were asleep, he carried the boy inside and laid him gently on the small cot. She followed with the girl, tucking her into a bed made of blankets on the floor. In the main room, he gestured toward his own bed in the corner. "You and the girl can take that," he said. "The floor's fine by me." She looked from the bed to his tired face, and a small, slow smile touched her lips. "There's room enough," she said. He lay down in the dark, the dull ache in his ribs a constant reminder of the price they had paid. The wind picked up outside, but it was just wind now, no longer a voice full of menace. He listened for a moment to the soft breathing of the others in the small, quiet house. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence that filled his home wasn't empty, it was peaceful.